2 weeks ago I painted Maximus from Corvus Belli's Gen Con exclusive box, and today I'm going to be painting Caskuda, his opponent, in that box. But instead of doing my usual thing recreating the box art, I'm going to be coming up with my own color scheme for him. I quite like the original box art, but what was bugging me was that it was just not buggy enough, I guess. I wanted to see something a bit more colorful.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures.
So in this video I'm going to walk you through both the thinking and the painting process, and also show you some of the mistakes I made along the way and also how I fixed them.
I started from a black primer, and then instead of doing my usual zenithal highlight, I wanted to do something a little bit more fancy, which then later on is going to bite me in the butt a little bit, you will see. First, I applied royal purple on the bottom part of the mini because I wanted this to be my shadow color. It also served the secondary purpose of becoming the undercoat for something even brighter, at least that was the plan. And there was also a third reason why I wanted to use the purple, and that's because Maximus has a lot of purple on him. So I wanted to use this purple shadow as well as the purple accents that this model is going to have to tie the two characters together and make it look like they are somehow in the same universe. Then I applied gory red on top of the model itself, so that this red is going to be my shadow color on the top half of the model. The genius idea behind this would be that the shadows at the bottom should be slightly different from the ones on the top, the ones on the top being a little bit more warm, and then on the bottom it would be cold. I was hoping that the effect would be quite subtle but still noticeable and fun. But unfortunately I made a major mistake because I was thinking too much about all this fanciness and how the purple is going to tie together the two models, but I forgot something crucial. See, my initial idea for this model was that the main color is going to be orange, and orange goes really well with the red, but it does not really go well with the purple, right? So as I apply this orange fire on top of this red and purple, you can probably already guess what's going to happen. And if you can't, then I'm going to tell you. Well, orange goes really well with the red, and it will yield a really nice and vibrant orange in the end. Unfortunately, over purple, orange just leads to brown. So while I was doing this, I immediately realized that, oh god, I actually outsmarted myself here. It was already obvious that it's not going to turn out exactly as I imagined. It's not going to be just a nice and vibrant orange all around. But I decided to press on because what is the worst that can happen? Maybe I have to repaint the whole thing. It's definitely not going to be ruined or anything, so I might as well see how the whole thing looks. And as you can see, the end result is like an ochre at the bottom and then an actual orange on the top, which suited me quite well actually. I decided that I quite like this color and it's a nice transition from one to the other. So as you can see, sometimes mistakes lead to happy accidents. So now that I decided that I'm going to keep this transition from ochre to orange, all I had to do was to emphasize it even more. So I mixed up a little bit of orange fire and golden yellow to make it even brighter and started painting this not on the whole surface that was orange, but let's say on 80% of it. And I also tried to focus it more around the torso and the head and everything that is kind of on the top of the model rather than in the middle or on the bottom.
Despite the little hiccup with the colors, I was actually quite happy with the end result, and at this point I just wanted to see what other elements are there on the model that I'm not supposed to be orange, and then just paint them black.
Honestly, at this point I didn't know exactly what colors I'm going to use, therefore I just used black on everything so that I can see what elements I am dealing with, and then later I can decide what exact color I'm going to paint them. The only solid idea I had was that I'm going to have the orange, that now changed a little bit, right, but I'm pretty happy with it. Then something purple needs to be in there because this has to still tie together with Maximus, and then I also wanted to have some nice non-metallic elements as well. The few exposed fleshy parts of Caskuda were the only thing I painted red rather than black because red just goes so much better over orange than over black. And because I already had the whole red for the fleshy parts on my palette, I decided to use this as my shadow color as well in the recesses. And I quickly went ahead and recess shaded the whole orange armor with this. This is one of those negative side effects of using an airbrush because it makes everything the same universal color, which means that the separation between the armor panels is going to be lost and we have to bring it back. But if I use black for this as I traditionally would, then I will lose a lot of color. Therefore, the red is still going to be a shadow, but it will be a colorful shadow.
Believe it or not, at this point I still didn't know what other colors I'm going to be using other than orange, so I just decided to procrastinate and edge highlight everything. I was hoping that having a finished armor would actually give me some kind of insight into what other elements I need around it.
Unfortunately for me, Caskuda's armor lends itself really well for edge highlighting because it has so many edges, so many armor panels, very mechanical looking in general, so my brain was kind of freed up to think about other other stuff, like for example what colors I'm going to be using. I was only keeping 3 general principles in mind while I was doing this. First of all, I needed to keep this paint job relatively vibrant in colors, so I was trying to use oranges and yellows as much as possible and only keep the whites to the very end. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that the eye of the viewer is drawn towards the head and the middle of the torso. If you think back, you might remember that I was already doing this with the airbrush highlights, and I'm just going to emphasize it further. And I accomplished it by using all the brightest highlight colors around that area only and not everywhere else on the model. And as for the third principle, I also used the highlight colors to add a little bit of noise into the armor panels by creating scratches and dots here and there.
Now that I had the armor finished, I didn't have any excuse not to work on some of the other elements, so I decided to go with something that is relatively small on the model because that would make it easy.
So I decided that I'm going to have the fleshy parts of Caskuda to be also kind of purplish color, but a different one from everything else. It should be a little bit more pinkish rather than purple. And also because this was supposed to be a different material, I wanted it to be more glossy and also have a little bit of a different texture, so I tried to stipple it on.
From the get-go, I knew that I wanted to have some major metal elements on this model, but what I didn't know is what kind of brightness I would be going for and what kind of colors I would be using. But fortunately for me, while painting this model, I was also working on another one, and there I used a certain type of metal that I thought would actually go pretty well on this model as well. The idea was pretty simple. I would use a cold bluish metal that would contrast nicely with the warm orange armor.
So I used my usual routine of non-metallics, but this time I was using mostly bluish colors to achieve it. With the brush, I created a very rough sketch of where the highlights should be, and I of course also did the edge highlights. I already knew that I would be using the airbrush to create some kind of highlights on the model. I didn't know exactly how I would be accomplishing that, but definitely it needed to happen because for now it's very, very orange and it needed a little bit of boosting. So that means that I would be using the airbrush anyway, and I can just use that to create some interesting colors inside the metals and also to smooth them out a little bit.
I ended up painting quite a few metal elements on this model and it took me some time, but once it was done, it was time to use the airbrush to add some more colors and smooth it out.
First, I decided to smoothen out the highlights by adding even more brightness into this, and I know this is already very, very bright, but I already had the plan in my head how I'm going to combat that with the next step. Next, I used anthracite gray. This allowed me to smoothen out the whole thing a little bit even more by spraying it into the midtones and also add some more interesting blue colors into the mix. And finally, I used a little bit of dark sea blue in the absolute shadows.
So at this point I had two of the main colors already on the model, and that is the orange armor and then the non-metallics, which were kind of bluish. So what should be the third color was the question. And it turned out to be a pretty easy decision in the end, because if you remember from the beginning of the video, I was already going for something purple to tie it together with Maximus. So I decided that the third major color is going to be simply purple. Not only is it a tying color with Maximus, but it also goes perfectly well with orange. Orange and purple is just a great combination.
First, I used the darker purple on the blades because I wanted them to be kind of different color overall, but still have the same highlights. And then later I switched over to a magenta, and this one I employed not only on the blades but also on some of the already established orange elements like the wings. And I have to admit that I was a little bit skeptical of this step because I already did a lot of work on this model and I had to now spray a really vibrant color on it without ruining it completely. And highlighting the blades was super easy because that doesn't have anything behind it, right? So if you just hold the model in the right way, you can spray it in a way that the airbrush doesn't hit anything else, so there is no masking needed. But there are a lot of other elements on this model that I had to spray, which I already did a lot of work on. So my heart was going a bit faster than usual because this was the first time I was using this color and this method like this, and I wasn't sure if I mixed it correctly because I wanted it to be thin enough so that it doesn't cover everything, it just kind of stains it. And I wanted the little elements that I already established, the highlights and the little notches, to be visible under the purple as well, ideally. But fortunately, the paint behaved almost exactly like I imagined, and the end result looked quite similar to what I envisioned. The only problem I had was a major mess up on one of the wings. I'm sure you guys know that feeling when initially you are super careful and everything goes relatively well, and then you grow confident and then start thinking about other things because you already mastered this, you know how this goes, and then suddenly you just mess it up. So what happened was that I used a different color to create a bit of a transition to something darker. So I used a scale 75 artist range color, which, as you might know, is thicker than your usual paint. And of course I did not take this into consideration, and I mixed it exactly as the previous color, and when it wasn't coming out of the nozzle the way I imagined, instead of seeing what the problem was, I was hasty and I tried to add a little bit more pressure to see if that would solve the problem. And as you can imagine, the end result was not that it was fixed, but instead it just splurted out a big blob of paint onto the wing, which left a huge mark, and I was left wondering how to fix that. And of course, in a situation like this, you can decide to repaint the whole thing, but I'm too lazy for that. So instead, I decided to use a little bit of whole red and pretend that that wing is way more in shadow than anything else, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because based on how we created the light on the model, that thing actually should be in the shadow. So in the end, this little mess that I created turned out to be a feature and not a bug. Or, well, it's on a bug, but whatever. I guess this shows you that you can correct any mistake and you don't have to panic just because you mess something up. In the end, it just turns into a happy accident.
After my little incident, everything went relatively smoothly, fortunately, and because I already had the main colors established, all I needed to do was to correct a couple of mistakes, put in a couple more edge highlights, and finish the little bits and bobs.
I applied a couple more highlights onto the purples. Fixed some of the brightest edge highlights on all the surfaces that were messed up a bit by the airbrushing step. And added the final highlights on all the surfaces with pure white. The purple surfaces already had some edge highlights under them, but I decided to also emphasize them a tiny bit in the end. And finally, there were also these little elements on the carapace around the model which look like eyes or maybe lenses, and I took these as an opportunity to introduce one more tiny accent color into the mix, which was green. So I undercoated all of them in pure white and even some of the edges around them. And I simply sprayed them with green fluorescent paint through the airbrush. And with that, the model was done and the end result looks like this.
Considering that I was just making it up as I went along and how many mistakes I made along the way, I think it looks pretty cool. But what do you guys think? Do you like this more or the one on the box art? Would you have done something differently? Would you have used a different color? Let's discuss in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and see you in the next one.